Welcome to our posts. Today we will see stories of r/malicious compliance. Boss insisted I work in the office today. My boss and I had a disagreement about working from home this week. The office is in San Francisco. I live in the East Bay and need to cross the Bay Bridge to get to work. We had an important presentation scheduled today. I wanted to do it virtual because the APEC meeting is in SF this week and everything seems disrupted. President Biden and Chinese President Xi are here. It's a 2-hour commute on a typical day, and I told my boss it might not be feasible to come in this week. He insisted I come in, so I said okay, but don't blame me if I get stuck in traffic. We had a pretty heated discussion about it. So today there's a huge backup on every freeway toward the Bay Bridge because protesters have chained themselves across all 5 lanes. The bridge is completely closed. Now the boss wants me to do the presentation virtual, but I told him I can't, I'm stuck in traffic. I can't operate my vehicle and do the presentation. You will have to do it without me, but he isn't really qualified. Next story. Cop keeps interrogating me on where I'm coming from? My pleasure. Disclaimer, I am a woman and was polite otherwise, your mileage may vary. When I was younger, I would visit natural parks. One time as I was driving home, a police officer pulled me over for alcohol testing. I politely complied, yet the officer must have thought I was peddling drugs or something because he asked for a further drug test and started interrogating me. I told him that I came from the natural park, yet he was asking me the same question on repeat. Finally, I kept a cordial demeanor, imagining myself as if I were talking to a coworker, and with the appropriate delivery, I went on a long monologue on how I enjoyed visiting natural parks, which road I took there, where I stopped for petrol, how much I paid for petrol, where I parked, which track I walked on, when did I decide to turn back on the track, which birds I saw on the track, the weather at the park, and so on. Finally, after a minute, he told me to shush and then let me go after the drug test came clear. I think some cops would have gotten more angry by this behavior, but what worked for me was my genuine delivery. Next story. People don't understand why you're leaving early. I was working for a smallish company, about 60 employees across several locations. IT support for both hardware, laptops, phones, and software. When I was hired, just under 9 years ago, it was verbally agreed that instead of clocking any callouts as overtime, I would just take the time in lieu. Callouts were always minimal and there were never any issues with me taking the time here and here to make up for it. Any calls in the middle of the night were quickly resolved, and I had no problem getting back to sleep. Appointments in the middle of the day were fine because of the additional hours from whenever. This worked well for almost my entire time there. I also always started early, just depending on when I left the house, got into the office, got my coffee, could have been anywhere between 5 and 30 minutes because I would leave the house earlier so as not to wake the family if school was off that day. I didn't care at that point. It never bothered me. They got free time from me, but again I did not care because honestly, what else did I have to do? It was a great job until it wasn't. One weekend I was working on some hardware maintenance, cleaning up wiring, Ethernet plugs, installing a new UPS. That took me the better part of Sunday to complete, 6 to 8 hours. This was understood, approved in advance, and appreciated. The following week I decided to start burning those extra hours up. I still came in early, as I had done for years, but started leaving an hour early from my regular end time every day if nothing was going on. This is important. If something needed done, I got it done. I was reachable via email until early evening, and phone pretty much 24/7. This particular week was slow, so I had nothing going on. I left an hour early for the first 4 days. On Friday, my boss comes to me and gently says, "People noticed that you've been leaving early this week. I'd like you to make sure you stay in your office until the scheduled end of day in case someone needs you." I explained to him that I was burning up lieu days and he just reiterated that it looks bad to others. Seriously? You can't tell the others that I work my 40 hours a week, just not at the same time as them? Fine. Cue the malicious compliance. I immediately submitted 4 hours of overtime for the hours that I didn't take in lieu. I still showed up at the office at whatever time I got there, but did not start any work until 8 a.m. If asked, I would say sure, 8 a.m. start time. If I got called outside of office hours, depending on how long I spent on the issue, I logged it as overtime. User calls me at 7 p.m. to ask a question. I answer him in 30 seconds, 1 hour OT. When my boss then started to ask, how come you're submitting all of this overtime? I responded with a simple, some people don't understand or like me taking lieu time, so I need to claim it as overtime since I am at my desk from 8 to 4. Because I wasn't available at his beck and call, it ended up costing them more money. 95% of my job could be done from home because of full remote access, but that stupid old school mentality means that people in the office need to see you at your desk all day long. I left the company very shortly after that for a much better paying job with full work from home. Know your worth. Next story. So sue me, really? This happened several years ago. I was working 40 hours per week programming at my main job, but I did occasional small projects in the evenings and on weekends for other clients. At one point, I was referred to a large company that runs major stadiums and event venues around the country. One of their stadiums is relatively close to where I live. I'll just call them Mark 1 for this story. The saga begins. This manager at Mark 1 said they wanted a simple administration database and user interface for employee timekeeping. Apparently, the old system they had was not working for them. I got details of what they wanted and drafted a set of specifications. Told them I could write the system to the specs for $2,000 flat rate. They agreed. I immediately went to work and churned out a database and UI for the system with full documentation in about 2 weeks. So I scheduled an in-person meeting to show them. Now when I showed up at the meeting, someone representing the security department was there. And he asked about getting some additional features. Sure, I told him, I can do that. So I went back, wrote up a change request and incorporated the additional features into the platform. I scheduled another meeting with Mark 1 for a couple of days later. When I got to that meeting, I noticed the audience had grown. There were 2 extra people from the finance department. Can you add feature X, feature Y, and feature Z? They asked. Sure, no problem. So I left, wrote up a CR and added the features. A few days later, I met with them again. Imagine my surprise when the audience size had grown and the new attendees asked for more features. This went on for about 5 more rounds, and I was getting frustrated that I had spec'd out a 2-week project that was now taking months. And I wouldn't be paid until I delivered, and they accepted the final product. But I chugged along implementing all their change requests. But one day the Mark 1 manager called me. Apparently she had been speaking with other departments that weren't represented in her status meetings of ever-increasing mass. She gave me a list of dozens of new features they wanted, some of which would require a complete redesign of the core database and an overhaul of the UI. I had had enough. I told her this is a complete overhaul of the original spec. I'll have to redesign and rebuild this from the ground up. Well, that's not my problem, she responded. Well, actually it is. I'm not going to design and build an entirely new system until you pay me for the current one, built to the specs we agreed on. After a short pause, she dropped a bomb on me. Well, we're not going to renegotiate. You can consider this project cancelled. That's not how this works. You still have to pay me for the work I've done. No, I don't. You haven't delivered anything. Sue me. And she hung up. Cue the malicious compliance. Meet me at the courthouse. I took Mark 1 manager's advice and went to the courthouse the next day to file in small claims court to recover $2,000 from Mark 1. On my court date a couple of months later, I went down to the courthouse and was greeted by an arbitrator. In my state, they have court-appointed arbitrators meet the litigants when they arrive to see if the parties can sort out the case with an agreement to maximize the judge's time. The arbitrator asked me, is there anything you would agree to resolve this immediately? I thought about it and said if they'll pay me 90%, $1,800, right now I'll drop the suit. He then went into a side room where the Mark 1 manager and the corporate lawyer were hanging out. I heard her screaming that they would either pay it all or pay zero. The arbitrator came to me with the news, and I told him I heard, and I'm happy to take it all. He laughed and said no, they want to go to trial. Fast forward a couple of hours. Fast forward is a funny phrase, considering how slow the court moved, but hey, and we're standing in front of the judge. I'm at my table alone, and the Mark 1 manager and lawyer are standing at the opposite table. The judge asked Mark 1 manager to tell her side first. She went into a very long speech about the project and corporate America and apple pie and thermonuclear weapons, and honestly, I have no idea because I stopped listening about 28 minutes ago. She talked non-stop for at least 30 minutes. Then the judge asked me for my story. Now I wasn't maliciously ignoring Mark 1 manager's long-winded tale of political intrigue and patriotism. I was actually formulating a strategy. I thought to myself, the judge probably had people who liked to speechify in front of him all day, every day. I also thought he might appreciate a short and sweet story that got straight to the point and didn't waste his time. So I said, Your Honor, they agreed to pay me $2,000 to design and build a software system for them. I completed the work based on the agreed specs, and then they decided to cancel the project after I was done. That was it. Then the judge asked me, How do I know you did the work? I had printed out the specs, change requests, documentation, and source code the night before. I lifted a ream of paper, 500 pages, from my table and offered it to the bailiff. Here's the code I wrote for them, Your Honor. The bailiff came to take it from me and the judge waved him off. No need, I can see it from here. The judge then asked Mark 1 manager, Is this true? She looked like she was in a daze. Yes. Then I fined for the plaintiff in the amount of $2,000. F you, pay me. About a month later, Mark 1 still hadn't paid. So I called the county sheriff and explained. Sent him the court judgment documents, and he said, No problem, they'll pay. The sheriff actually called me later that day. He was on a cell phone and I could hear him talking to the Mark 1 manager. He told her, Cut a check for $2,000 right now, or he was going to rip your computers out of the wall and auction them off until the judgment is satisfied. I don't know if he had that authority, but the sheriff seemed to have a grudge against Mark 1, and he was reveling in the opportunity to dog them out. Apparently Mark 1 believed he had the authority because, long story short, the sheriff had a $2,000 check in his hand about 15 minutes later, and it was in my mailbox about a week later. I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share and subscribe the channel or posts.